Desert Final Justice. Emmy Callahan had spent years on the run, but when a winter storm forced her into Ethan Slade's cabin, she realized she might have just run into trouble. He watched her from across the fire, his voice rough as the wind outside. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. "Reckon you'll be staying here, then." Chapter 1. The Fury of the Frozen Plains. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing across the vast, snow-covered plains, each gust a frozen knife against Emmeline Callahan's exposed skin. Her horse, a sturdy mare named Bess, struggled against the onslaught, hooves slipping on the icy patches hidden beneath the deceptively soft-looking drifts. Emmy leaned forward, pressing her cheek against Bess's warm neck, her own body numb with a cold that seeped deeper than bone. She'd been riding for days, pushing herself and Bess to their limits, driven by a desperation that clawed at her insides as fiercely as the storm. The landscape, once familiar in its stark beauty, was now a swirling white menace. Landmarks had vanished, swallowed by the blizzard, leaving Emmy disoriented and increasingly afraid. She'd thought she could outrun the winter storm that had been brewing on the horizon, but she'd underestimated its ferocity, its relentless pursuit. Now, it felt as if the storm itself was a manifestation of the demons she was fleeing, a physical embodiment of the past that clung to her like a shroud. She squinted, trying to pierce the veil of snow, searching for any sign of shelter, a stand of trees, a rocky outcrop, anything that could offer some respite from the wind's brutal assault. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy, tightened on the reins, the leather slick with ice. Hope, a fragile ember she'd been guarding for so long, threatened to be extinguished by the sheer hopelessness of her situation. Emmy wasn't a woman easily given to fear. Years of hardship, of running and hiding, had forged a resilience in her, a steely core that had allowed her to survive. But this was different. This was a cold that could kill, a loneliness that could crush the spirit. She'd faced down outlaws, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and stared death in the face more times than she cared to remember. Yet, the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the frozen plains, amplified by the howling wind, filled her with a dread she hadn't known she was capable of. A sudden, sharp gust of wind nearly ripped her from the saddle. Bess stumbled, whinnying in fear, and Emmy felt a surge of panic. If she lost Bess, she was lost. The thought spurred her on, igniting a flicker of defiance within her. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't. She'd come too far, sacrificed too much, to succumb to the elements now. Through the blinding snow, she saw it, a faint, flickering light, almost swallowed by the whiteness. A cabin, or a mirage, a cruel trick of the fading light. But it was the only hope she had. She urged Bess forward, her voice hoarse as she whispered encouragement to the exhausted animal. "Just a little further, girl. Just a little further." The cabin, as she drew closer, proved to be real. It was small, rough-hewn, with smoke curling from a stone chimney, a testament to someone's tenacity in the face of the wilderness. A single window glowed with the warm, inviting light of a fire. Emmy felt a surge of relief, so profound it almost brought her to her knees. She slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. The snow reached her knees, the wind whipping at her coat, trying to steal the last vestiges of warmth from her body. She stumbled towards the cabin, Bess trailing behind her, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. Reaching the door, she hesitated. Fear, a different kind now, tightened her chest. Who was inside? An outlaw, hiding from the law? A reclusive mountain man, hostile to strangers? Or worse, someone who recognized her, someone who knew the secrets she'd buried so deep. But the cold was a more immediate threat. She raised a gloved hand and knocked, the sound swallowed by the wind. The door creaked open, revealing a sliver of warmth and light. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and imposing, his face obscured by shadow. Emmy couldn't make out his features, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, assessing, questioning. "Lost, are you?" His voice was deep, roughened by the elements, like the wind itself given human form. It held a note of weary resignation, as if he'd seen too much hardship in his life to be surprised by anything, even a woman appearing out of a blizzard. Emmy swallowed, her throat dry. "My horse, we need shelter." Her voice was barely a whisper, carried away by the wind. The man remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Emmy felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He exuded a sense of danger, a quiet intensity that made her instinctively wary. But she had nowhere else to go. She was at his mercy. Finally, he stepped aside, a grudging invitation.
"Come in, then, before you freeze to death."
Emmy led Bess towards a small, ramshackle stable attached to the side of the cabin. The wind was slightly less fierce here, offering some protection. She unsaddled Bess, rubbing her down with a handful of straw, her hands shaking with exhaustion and cold. The mare nuzzled her gratefully, her warm breath a comfort in the desolate surroundings. When she turned back towards the cabin, the man was still standing in the doorway, watching her. The firelight flickered, illuminating his face for the first time. He was older than she'd initially thought, his face weathered and lined, etched with the hardships of a life lived on the edge. His eyes, though, were what caught her attention. They were a piercing blue, intense and knowing, as if they could see straight through her, to the secrets she guarded so fiercely. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured, his voice rough as the wind outside. His words were a statement, not a question, and his eyes held that unwavering challenge. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over her, from her worn boots to the strands of hair that had escaped her braid. Emmy met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. She wouldn't cower, not even here, not even now. "No," she admitted, her voice stronger this time. "Nowhere else." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Reckon you'll be stayin' here, then." He stepped back inside, leaving the door open for her. It wasn't an invitation, not exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a reluctant acceptance of the inevitable. And in that moment, standing on the threshold of the unknown, Emmy realized that she might have just run from one kind of danger straight into another. The storm outside was brutal, but the storm brewing inside the cabin, the storm in the eyes of the man who offered her shelter, might be even more perilous. She stepped across the threshold. Chapter 2. Shelter from the storm's embrace. The cabin was small, a single room dominated by a large stone fireplace that crackled with a welcoming fire. The heat washed over Emmy, a tangible wave that eased the biting cold that had settled deep in her bones. She stood just inside the doorway, hesitant, feeling like an intruder in this starkly masculine space. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, pine, and something else, something indefinably masculine, a mixture of leather and sweat and something wilder, untamed. It was a scent that both unsettled and comforted her, a reminder of the harsh realities of this frontier life. The furnishings were sparse and functional, a rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs, a narrow cot pushed against one wall, a few shelves holding a meager collection of supplies. A rifle hung above the fireplace, its presence a silent testament to the ever-present dangers of this land. Everything spoke of a solitary existence, a life stripped down to the bare essentials. Ethan Slade, she hadn't asked his name, but she'd heard it in the way he'd spoken to Bess, a low, rumbling command that the mare had obeyed instantly moved with a quiet efficiency, adding wood to the fire, his movements economical and practiced. He hadn't offered her his name, nor had he asked for hers. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a reflection of the unspoken code of the West, where questions were often left unasked and answers were given only when deemed necessary. He glanced at her, his blue eyes still holding that unsettling intensity. "There's stew on the hearth. Help yourself." Emmy nodded, her stomach clenching with a mixture of hunger and nerves. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, relying on dried meat and hardtack. The aroma of the stew, rich and savory, was almost overwhelming. She found a tin bowl and spoon on a shelf and ladled herself a generous portion. The stew was thick with chunks of venison and root vegetables, surprisingly flavorful. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, the warmth spreading through her chilled body. Ethan watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. He sat in one of the chairs by the fire, cleaning his rifle with a practiced hand. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Emmy finished her stew and placed the bowl on the table. She felt a strange reluctance to break the silence, to intrude on his solitary world. But she couldn't stay here, a silent, unwelcome guest forever. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding oddly loud in the small cabin. "For the shelter and the food." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the rifle. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon. You're welcome to stay the night." It wasn't an offer of friendship, she knew. It was a practical consideration, a recognition of the dangers of the storm. But it was more than she'd expected. "I don't want to be any trouble," she said, her hands twisting together in her lap. He finally looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "You already are." The bluntness of his words startled her. She wasn't sure how to respond. Was it her presence, her intrusion into his solitude? That was the trouble? Or was it something else, something he saw in her, something that reminded him of his own past? I can leave in the morning," she offered, her voice hesitant. He shook his head. "Not in this weather. You wouldn't make it a mile." He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "Stay as long as you need." Emmy felt a flicker of relief, mixed with a growing sense of unease. She was trapped here, dependent on the kindness or at least the tolerance of a stranger. A stranger who exuded an aura of danger, of secrets hidden beneath a stoic exterior. He returned his attention to his rifle, his silence a dismissal. Emmy retreated to the cot, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. She wrapped herself in a thick, wool blanket, the rough texture a small comfort against the cold. She lay there, listening to the wind and the crackling fire, her mind racing. She was safe from the storm for now. But she was also trapped, confined with a man she didn't know, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the reason she was running. The memories, sharp and painful, flooded her mind. She'd hoped to outrun them, to find some semblance of peace in the vast emptiness of the West. But it seemed that peace was a luxury she couldn't afford. As the hours passed, the storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within her. She closed her eyes, trying to find some solace in sleep, but it eluded her. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent a jolt of fear through her. She wondered about Ethan Slade, about the life that had led him to this isolated cabin. What secrets did he hide? What demons did he battle? And why had he allowed her, a stranger, to enter his carefully guarded world? The fire began to die down, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Emmy watched them dance, feeling a strange kinship with their ephemeral Chapter 3. Ethan Slade's watchful eyes. The first rays of dawn, pale and weak, filtered through the single window of the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Emmy lay still, listening to the sounds of Ethan moving about the room. He was already up, tending to the fire, his movements quiet and efficient. The storm had subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence, a world muffled by a thick blanket of snow. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The cabin was still cold, but the fire had taken the edge off the chill. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, simply went about his morning routine, as if she weren't even there. Emmy felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. She was grateful for his shelter, for the unspoken offer of protection. But his silence, his constant watchfulness, unnerved her. It was as if he were waiting for something, observing her, trying to decipher who she was and why she was here. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the strong aroma filling the cabin. He didn't offer her any, and she didn't ask. She watched him as he drank, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a man of few words, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. "The storm's past," he said finally, his voice rough, breaking the silence. "You can leave whenever you're ready." It wasn't an invitation to stay, nor was it a dismissal. It was simply a statement of fact.
"Thank you," she said, her voice soft. I don't know where I'll go."
He looked at her then, his blue eyes piercing. "That's your concern, not mine." His words were harsh, but she sensed a flicker of something else beneath the surface.
Pity? Concern?
She couldn't be sure. She rose from the cot, folding the blanket neatly. She felt stiff and sore from the long ride and the uncomfortable night. She needed to move, to stretch her muscles, to escape the confines of the cabin, the intensity of his gaze. "I'll check on my horse," she said, turning towards the door.
"Bess is fine," he said.
"I fed her and watered her this morning."
Emmy stopped, surprised.
He'd taken care of her horse without being asked. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Beneath his rough exterior, there was a hint of kindness? Or perhaps it was simply the ingrained habit of a man who understood the importance of caring for animals in this harsh land. "Thank you," she said again, her voice slightly warmer this time. He shrugged, dismissing her gratitude. "She's a good horse. Deserves to be looked after." Emmy stepped outside, into the blinding whiteness of the snow-covered landscape. The air was crisp and clean, the silence almost deafening after the howling wind of the previous night. The world was transformed, a pristine canvas of white, untouched by human hand. She walked towards the stable, her boots crunching in the snow. Bess greeted her with a soft whinny, nuzzling her hand. Emmy stroked the mare's warm neck, feeling a surge of affection for the animal that had carried her through so much. She spent the next hour tending to Bess, brushing her coat, checking her hooves. It was a familiar routine, a comforting ritual that helped to calm her nerves. The physical exertion also helped to ease the stiffness in her muscles. As she worked, she thought about Ethan Slade. He was an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. He was clearly a man of the West, hardened by the elements, accustomed to solitude. But there was something else, something hidden beneath the surface, a vulnerability that he guarded fiercely. She wondered about his past, about the events that had shaped him into the man he was. What had brought him to this isolated cabin? What secrets did he carry? And why did he seem so wary, so distrustful? She finished tending to Bess and returned to the cabin. Ethan was sitting by the fire, reading a worn book. He looked up as she entered, his eyes questioning. "I'm going to make some breakfast," she said, feeling a need to break the silence, to offer something in return for his hospitality. He nodded, returning to his book. Emmy found some dried meat and beans in a cupboard and began to prepare a simple meal. She worked quietly, aware of his presence, of his watchful eyes. As they ate, the silence between them felt less oppressive, less charged with unspoken questions. They ate without speaking, sharing the meal in a companionable quiet that surprised her. It was as if, by sharing this simple act of sustenance, they had reached some unspoken understanding, a temporary truce in the midst of their uncertainties. After breakfast, Emmy gathered her few belongings. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. She needed to move on, to find a place where she could start anew, where she could escape the ghosts of her past. But where could she go? She had no destination, no plan, only a vague hope that somewhere, somehow, she could find a place where she belonged. She turned to Ethan, who was watching her, his expression as always unreadable. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even her. "For everything." He nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "Be careful out there." It was the closest he'd come to offering any words of comfort, any sign of concern. And yet it was enough. Emmy stepped out of the cabin, into the bright sunlight, leaving behind the shelter and the enigmatic man who had offered it. As she rode away, she glanced back, one last time. Ethan was standing in the doorway, watching her, his figure silhouetted against the light. He didn't wave, didn't speak. He simply watched, his blue eyes following her until she disappeared from view. And in that moment, Emmy knew that she wouldn't forget him. She wouldn't forget the storm, the shelter, or the watchful eyes of Ethan Slade. She had a sense that their paths would one day cross again, that their brief encounter was not a conclusion, but a beginning. A premonition as fragile and as certain as new ice hung within her. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Haunted Past. Days turned into weeks, and Emmy found herself settling into a reluctant routine at Ethan's cabin. The initial urgency to leave had faded, replaced by a strange sense of not peace, exactly, but a respite from the constant fear that had been her companion for so long. The weather remained harsh, the snow deep, making travel difficult, if not impossible. Ethan didn't press her to leave, nor did he encourage her to stay. He simply accepted her presence, a silent, watchful figure in his solitary world. They fell into a pattern of shared chores and silent meals. Emmy took on the responsibility of cooking and cleaning, while Ethan tended to the animals, chopped wood, and maintained the cabin. They spoke little, their conversations limited to the practicalities of survival. Yet, beneath the surface of their silence, a connection began to form. It wasn't a connection based on words, but on shared experience, on a mutual understanding of the hardships of frontier life. They were two solitary souls, drawn together by circumstance, finding a strange comfort in each other's presence. Emmy learned more about Ethan through observation than through conversation. She noticed the way his hands, calloused and scarred, moved with a gentle precision when he cared for the animals. She saw the sadness that flickered in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, a fleeting glimpse of a pain he kept carefully hidden. She heard the faint, almost imperceptible sigh that escaped him sometimes, a sound of weariness, of resignation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Emmy noticed a small, wooden box on a shelf. It was intricately carved, with a design of intertwined leaves and flowers. It seemed out of place in the starkly functional cabin, a touch of beauty in a world of harsh practicality. "What's in the box?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Ethan glanced at the box, his expression hardening. "Nothing that concerns you." His response was curt, shutting her out. Emmy felt a flicker of disappointment, but she didn't press him. She understood the need for privacy, the desire to keep certain things hidden. But the box intrigued her. It was a symbol of a life beyond the cabin, a life that Ethan had chosen to leave behind. It was a reminder that he had a past that he guarded fiercely. Later that night, as she lay on the cot, listening to the wind howling outside, Emmy couldn't shake the image of the box from her mind. She wondered what secrets it held, what stories it could tell. She found herself thinking about her own past, about the secrets she carried. She'd been running for so long, trying to escape the memories, the pain, the guilt. But the past had a way of catching up, of clinging to you like a shadow. She'd been married once, to a man named Samuel. He'd been a good man, kind and gentle, but he'd been caught up in a feud that wasn't his own, a conflict between rival ranchers that had turned bloody. He'd been killed, an innocent victim of a senseless war. Emmy had blamed herself. She'd urged him to leave, to escape the violence, but he'd refused, bound by a sense of loyalty to his family, to his land. She'd fled after his death, fearing for her own life, carrying the burden of her guilt, the weight of her loss. She'd changed her name, drifted from town to town, taking on odd jobs, trying to disappear, to become someone else. But the past had followed her, haunting her dreams, coloring her every waking moment. She wondered if Ethan had a similar story, a similar burden of grief and guilt. She sensed a kinship with him, a shared understanding of loss and regret. One morning, Emmy found Ethan outside, staring out at the vast, snow-covered landscape. His face was etched with a sadness, so profound it made her heart ache. She approached him quietly, her footsteps muffled by the snow.
"What are you thinking about?"
she asked softly, her voice hesitant. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I'm thinking about all the things I've lost." His words resonated with her, echoing her own pain. She stood beside him, silently offering her support, her understanding. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "I think the past is all there is. That the future is just a repeat of the mistakes we've already made." Emmy understood. She'd felt that way herself many times. The despair, the hopelessness, the feeling that there was no escape from the shadows of the past. "I don't believe that," she said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. "I believe we can change. We can learn from our mistakes. We can find a way to live again." He turned to her then, his blue eyes searching hers. He seemed to be looking for something, some sign of hope, some reassurance that her words were true. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. Emmy met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "I have to," she said. "Otherwise I wouldn't be here." A flicker of something understanding, perhaps, or even hope crossed his face. He didn't speak, but he reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a shiver through her. It was the first time he'd touched her, the first sign of physical connection between them. A spark, unexpected, and as warm as the weak winter sun, ignited deep within her. She didn't pull away. Chapter 5. The unspoken truce of winter. The touch, brief as it was, marked a subtle shift in the dynamic between Emmy and Ethan. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a trickle of emotion that had been held back for too long. The silence between them, while still present, felt less heavy, less charged with unspoken questions. They began to talk, not about their pasts, not yet, but about the present, about the small details of their daily lives. Emmy learned that Ethan had been living in the cabin for 5 years, having arrived there after he didn't say. He simply said he needed to get away. She learned that he was a skilled hunter and trapper, that he knew the land intimately, that he respected the wilderness and its creatures. He taught her how to track animals, how to read the signs of the weather, how to survive in this harsh environment. Emmy, in turn, shared her knowledge of cooking and gardening, skills she'd learned from her mother. She discovered that Ethan had a surprising fondness for her apple pie, a small pleasure that brought a flicker of a smile to his weathered face. They worked together, side by side, their movements becoming increasingly synchronized, their understanding of each other growing with each passing day. They were like two pieces of a puzzle, slowly fitting together, forming a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. The long winter evenings were spent by the fire, reading, mending clothes, or simply sitting in companionable silence. Sometimes, Ethan would play a harmonica, the mournful melodies filling the cabin with a bittersweet beauty. Emmy found herself drawn to the music, to the emotions it evoked, emotions that she'd kept buried for so long. One evening, as he played, Emmy noticed a small, silver locket hanging around his neck. It was partially hidden by his shirt, but she caught a glimpse of it as he moved. She wondered who it belonged to, what story it held.
She didn't ask, though.
She was learning to respect his privacy, to wait for him to open up, to share his secrets when he was ready. She knew that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, especially on the frontier. As the weeks passed, Emmy began to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of home. It was a strange feeling, unexpected, considering the circumstances. She'd been running for so long, searching for a place to rest, a place to feel safe. And she'd found it, in the most unlikely of places, in a remote cabin with a man who was as much a mystery as the wilderness that surrounded them. She knew it couldn't last forever. The snow would eventually melt, the roads would become passable, and she would have to make a decision about her future. But for now, she was content to live in the present, to cherish the small moments of connection, the unspoken truce of winter that had bound them together. One afternoon, while Ethan was out hunting, Emmy decided to clean the cabin. She dusted the shelves, swept the floor, and organized the few supplies. As she reached for the wooden box on the shelf, she hesitated. She knew Ethan wouldn't want her to touch it, but her curiosity was overwhelming. She glanced towards the door, making sure he wasn't returning. Then, she carefully lifted the box from the shelf. It was heavier than she expected. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. She recognized the name on the top envelope, Sarah. She knew she shouldn't read them, but she couldn't resist. She carefully untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It was dated 10 years ago, and it was filled with words of love, of longing, of a future that had never come to be. As she read the letters, a story unfolded, a story of a young woman, deeply in love with a man named Ethan. A story of a life they had planned together, a life that had been tragically cut short. Emmy felt a pang of sadness, a deep empathy for the woman who had written these letters, and for the man who had lost her. She understood now the source of Ethan's pain, the reason for his solitude, his guarded heart. She carefully placed the letters back in the box, tied the ribbon, and returned it to the shelf. She felt a sense of guilt, of having intruded on something sacred, something deeply personal. When Ethan returned, she didn't mention the box, didn't let on that she knew his secret. But she looked at him differently now, with a new understanding, a deeper compassion. She saw the pain behind his eyes, the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. That night, as they sat by the fire, Emmy found herself wanting to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, to let him know that he wasn't alone.
But she didn't know how.
The words seemed inadequate, clumsy. Instead, she simply sat beside him, her presence a silent offering of support. He glanced at her, his blue eyes searching hers. He seemed to sense the shift in her, the new depth of understanding. He didn't speak, but he reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement of their connection, of the unspoken bond that had formed between them. And in that moment, the unspoken truce of winter became something more, something deeper, something that hinted at the possibility of a shared future. The silence was no longer empty, but full, rich with an understanding only forged in shared solitude and, perhaps, shared pain. The fire crackled, mirroring the fragile warmth growing in the space between their clasped hands. Chapter 6. Beneath the cracks of a hardened heart. The hand-holding became a nightly ritual, a silent acknowledgement of the growing bond between Emmy and Ethan. It was a small gesture, but it held immense significance, a bridge across the chasm of their individual sorrows. They still didn't speak of their pasts, but the need to do so felt less urgent, less pressing. Their shared present was building a foundation of trust, slowly but surely. Emmy continued to observe Ethan, noticing the subtle nuances of his behavior, the small cracks in his hardened exterior. She saw the way he cared for the animals, the gentleness he displayed towards Bess, the way he would sometimes stare out at the landscape, his face etched with a longing that mirrored her own. She also noticed his nightmares. He would often cry out in his sleep, his body thrashing, his voice filled with a terror she could only imagine. She would lie awake, listening to him, her heart aching for his pain. She longed to comfort him, to hold him, to tell him that he wasn't alone. But she knew he wasn't ready for that, not yet. One morning, after a particularly bad night, Emmy found Ethan outside, chopping wood with a ferocity that bordered on violence. His movements were jerky, his face pale and drawn. He seemed to be trying to exorcise his demons through physical exertion. Emmy approached him cautiously.
"Ethan?"
she said softly. He didn't stop chopping, didn't even acknowledge her presence. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. He flinched, as if her touch burned him. "Ethan," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "Stop." He finally stopped, the axe dropping to the ground with a thud. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a raw pain that took her breath away. "I can't," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I can't do this anymore." Emmy didn't know what this was, but she understood the depth of his despair. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. This time, he didn't pull away. "You don't have to do it alone," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm here." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be struggling with something, wrestling with an internal battle. I don't deserve you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Emmy squeezed his hand. "Don't say that. We all deserve a second chance. We all deserve to be happy." He shook his head, his eyes filled with self-loathing.
You don't know what I've done. You don't know who I am.
I know you're a good man, Ethan, she said, her voice unwavering. I see it in the way you care for the animals, in the way you look at the land, in the way you hold my hand. He closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. Sarah, he whispered, the name a barely audible sigh. Emmy knew, instinctively, that Sarah was the woman in the letters, the woman he had loved and lost. She felt a pang of jealousy, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of compassion. Tell me about her, she said softly. He opened his eyes, surprised by her words. He hesitated, then, slowly, reluctantly, he began to speak. He told her about Sarah, about their life together, about their dreams of building a ranch, of raising a family. He told her about the accident, a runaway wagon, a moment of carelessness, a life tragically cut short. He blamed himself, he said. He'd been driving the wagon. He should have been more careful. He should have been able to save her. Emmy listened, her heart aching for his pain. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. She simply listened, offering him the comfort of her presence, the support of her silence. When he finished, he was silent, his body trembling. Emmy reached out and gently wiped away the tears that were streaming down his face. It wasn't your fault, Ethan, she said softly. It was an accident. You have to let go of the guilt. He shook his head. I can't. I'll never forgive myself. Then I'll forgive you, she said, her voice firm. I'll forgive you for both of us. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emmy leaned forward and kissed him, her lips gently brushing against his. It was a chaste kiss, a gesture of comfort, of compassion, of understanding. But it was also something more. It was a spark of hope, a promise of a new beginning. Ethan responded, his arms slowly wrapping around her, pulling her close. He held her tight, as if he were afraid to let go, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. And in that moment, beneath the cracks of his hardened heart, Emmy felt the stirring of something new, something fragile but powerful, the possibility of love, reborn from the ashes of loss. The snow, still piled deep outside, seemed less cold, less formidable, as the warmth of their embrace began to thaw the frozen landscape of their hearts. Chapter 7. Shared Meals and Silent Stories. The kiss, a turning point in their relationship, ushered in a new phase of intimacy. While still reserved, Ethan began to open up, sharing fragments of his past, revealing the man beneath the stoic exterior. The shared meals, once silent affairs, became opportunities for quiet conversation, for the slow unraveling of their individual stories. Emmy, in turn, began to share her own past, revealing the details of her marriage to Samuel, the pain of his death, the fear that had driven her to run. She spoke of the guilt she carried, the feeling that she had somehow failed him, that she should have been able to prevent his death. Ethan listened, his blue eyes filled with understanding and compassion. He didn't offer judgment, didn't try to minimize her pain. He simply listened, offering the silent support that she had offered him. We all carry burdens, Emmy, he said one evening, as they sat by the fire. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them, to try to be better. His words resonated with her, offering a sense of validation, of hope. She realized that she wasn't alone in her pain, that Ethan understood her in a way that no one else ever had. They began to share stories, not just of their past sorrows, but of their childhoods, of their dreams, of their hopes for the future. Emmy learned that Ethan had grown up on a ranch, that he had always loved the land, that he had dreamed of having a family of his own. She, in turn, shared her love of books, her desire to travel, her longing for a place to call home. They discovered that they had more in common than they had initially thought, that their shared experiences had forged a bond that transcended their differences. The meals became more elaborate, Emmy experimenting with the limited supplies, creating dishes that reminded her of her childhood, of her mother's cooking. Ethan, in turn, would bring her small gifts from the wilderness, a perfectly formed pine cone, a feather from a hawk, a smooth, gray stone. These small gestures, these silent offerings spoke volumes. They were a testament to their growing affection, to the unspoken language of love that was developing between them. One evening, as they were eating dinner, Ethan said, "You know, you've changed things around here." Emmy looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" He gestured around the cabin. "It feels different. More like a home." Emmy smiled.
"I'm glad."
He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Thank you, Emmy, for everything." His words were simple, but they were filled with emotion. Emmy felt her heart swell with a happiness she hadn't known she was capable of. She realized that she was falling in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming passion, but a slow, steady burn, a warmth that grew with each passing day. She loved his quiet strength, his gentle spirit, his deep connection to the land. She loved the way he looked at her, the way he listened to her, the way he made her feel safe and protected. She knew he felt the same way, although he hadn't said the words. She saw it in his eyes, in his touch, in the small gestures of affection that had become a part of their daily routine. One afternoon, while Ethan was out checking his traps, Emmy decided to explore the area around the cabin. The snow was still deep, but the sun was shining, and the air was crisp and clean. She walked along a small stream, her boots crunching in the snow, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She came across a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees. The snow here was untouched, a pristine blanket of white. She stood there for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene, the silence, the stillness. She felt a sense of peace, of contentment, that she hadn't felt in years. She realized that she had found a place where she could heal, a place where she could start anew. And she had found it with Ethan, a man who understood her pain, who shared her dreams, who offered her the promise of a future she had thought was lost forever. As she walked back to the cabin, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, watching her. He smiled as she approached, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his weathered face. She smiled back, her heart filled with a love that was as deep and as vast as the wilderness that surrounded them. The silent stories they had shared over simple meals had woven a tapestry of connection, stronger and more enduring than the harsh winter that had brought them together. She reached for his outstretched hand, the warmth of his touch a familiar comfort, a promise of more shared meals, and more silent stories to come. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the cabin, a welcoming beacon in the fading light. Chapter 8. The Thaw and the Threat It Brings. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, the snow gradually melting, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. The air grew warmer, the days longer, and the sounds of birdsong filled the air. The thaw brought a sense of renewal, of hope, but it also brought a sense of unease. Emmy knew that their time together in the cabin was coming to an end. The roads would soon be passable, and she would have to make a decision about her future. She could stay with Ethan, build a life with him in this remote wilderness, or she could move on, continue her search for a place to call home. The thought of leaving Ethan filled her with a sadness she hadn't anticipated. She had fallen deeply in love with him, and the idea of being apart from him was almost unbearable. But she also knew that staying might not be the best option. Ethan still carried the burden of his past, the guilt and grief over Sarah's death. She wasn't sure if he was ready for a new relationship, if he could ever truly let go of the past. Ethan, too, seemed to be wrestling with his own demons. He was quieter than usual, more withdrawn, spending long hours outside alone. Emmy sensed that he was struggling with the decision of whether to ask her to stay, whether to risk opening his heart again. One afternoon, as they were walking along the stream, now swollen with meltwater, Emmy decided to broach the subject. "The snow's almost gone," she said, her voice hesitant. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the rushing water. "Soon be able to travel." It wasn't a question, but it hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his blue eyes searching hers.
"I don't know," he said.
"What about you?" Emmy hesitated. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, that she wanted to stay with him forever. But she was afraid of rejection, afraid of breaking the fragile bond that had formed between them. I haven't decided, she said, her voice evasive. He looked away, his expression disappointed. Emmy felt a pang of regret, a sense of missed opportunity. That evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Ethan finally spoke. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said, his voice low and serious.
About us.
Emmy's heart pounded in her chest. She waited, holding her breath, unsure of what he was going to say. I know I haven't been easy, he continued. I've got a lot of baggage. But you've made me feel things I haven't felt in years. You've made me feel alive again. Emmy reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I know, she said softly. He squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting hers. I don't want you to leave, Emmy, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I want you to stay. With me. Tears welled up in Emmy's eyes. It was the moment she'd been waiting for, the words she'd longed to hear. But now that they were spoken, she felt a surge of fear, of uncertainty. I don't know, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling.
I'm afraid.
Afraid of what? He asked, his voice gentle. Afraid of messing things up, she said. Afraid of not being enough. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. You are enough, Emmy, he said, his voice firm. You're more than enough. And we won't mess things up. We'll take it slow. We'll figure it out together. Emmy rested her head on his shoulder, her tears flowing freely. She felt a sense of relief, of release. She had finally admitted her fears, and he had accepted them, embraced them. I love you, Ethan, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He held her tighter, his lips brushing against her hair. I love you too, Emmy, he said, his voice equally emotional. It was the first time they had spoken the words aloud, the first time they had acknowledged the depth of their feelings for each other. And in that moment, all their doubts, all their fears, seemed to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of love, of hope, of a future together. But the thaw, while bringing them closer, also brought an unwelcome visitor. A lone rider, a stranger, appeared at the cabin one afternoon, his arrival shattering the peace and tranquility they had found. He was a rough-looking man, with a weathered face and shifty eyes. He claimed to be a trapper, lost and looking for shelter. Ethan, wary but bound by the code of the West, offered him hospitality. Emmy felt a sense of unease, a premonition of danger, as the stranger entered their sanctuary. Something about his demeanor, the way his eyes darted around, assessing, made her skin crawl. And as he sat down by the fire, accepting a cup of coffee from Ethan, Emmy knew that the thaw had brought not only the promise of a new beginning, but also the threat of an unknown and potentially dangerous future. The stranger's presence was a cold wind, chilling the warmth of their newfound declaration. Chapter 9. Secrets Whispered in the Dead of Night. The stranger, who introduced himself as Jed, stayed for several days. He was a man of few words, offering little information about himself, and his presence cast a pall over the cabin. Emmy found herself constantly on edge, watching him, wary of his every move. Ethan, while polite and hospitable, also seemed to be on guard. He never left Emmy alone with Jed, and he always kept his rifle within easy reach. The unspoken truce that had existed between Emmy and Ethan before Jed's arrival was now strained, replaced by a shared sense of apprehension. Jed spent most of his time observing, his eyes constantly scanning the cabin, taking in every detail. He asked questions, seemingly innocuous, about Ethan's life, about the area, about any nearby settlements. Emmy noticed that he seemed particularly interested in Ethan's past, probing for information with a subtle persistence that made her uneasy. One evening, as they were eating dinner, Jed said, "You've been out here a long time, haven't you, Ethan?" Ethan nodded, his expression noncommittal. 5 years. 5 years is a long time to be alone, Jed said, his eyes glinting. Must have a reason for hiding out here. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Emmy felt a surge of anger towards Jed, towards his intrusive questions, his veiled accusations. "Ethan's not hiding," she said, her voice sharp. "He's living here. There's a difference." Jed turned his gaze to her, his eyes cold and assessing. "Is that so? And what about you, little lady? What brings you to this neck of the woods?" Emmy met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated.
"I was caught in the storm," she said.
"Ethan offered me shelter." Jed smiled, a cynical, knowing smile. "That's a convenient story." Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough, Jed," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're a guest in my home. Show some respect." Jed held up his hands, a gesture of mock surrender. "Just making conversation," he said. "No need to get riled up." But the tension remained, thick and heavy, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Emmy knew that Jed was dangerous, that he was more than just a lost trapper. She sensed that he had a hidden agenda, a purpose for being here that went beyond seeking shelter. That night, Emmy couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the cabin, to Ethan's breathing, to Jed's restless movements in the corner. She felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something bad was going to happen. She got out of bed and quietly went to the window. The moon was full, casting a silvery light over the snow-covered landscape. She saw Ethan standing outside, his figure silhouetted against the light. He was staring out at the wilderness, his face etched with worry. Emmy slipped on her coat and went outside. Ethan turned as she approached, his expression softening slightly. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "I don't like him, Ethan," she said, her voice low. "I don't trust him." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the distance. "I know. I don't either. What do we do?" she asked. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. We can't just throw him out, not without proof that he's up to no good. It's the code of the West. We offer hospitality to those in need. But what if he's not in need?" she said. "What if he's here for another reason?" Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About me hiding out here." Emmy looked at him, her eyes questioning. "I think he knows something, Emmy," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
"I think he knows about Sarah."
Emmy's heart skipped a beat.
"How could he?"
Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. But I have a bad feeling." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to be careful, Emmy," he said. "We need to watch him. And we need to be ready for anything." Emmy nodded, her own fear mirroring his. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever it is." They stood there for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their gazes locked. The silence of the night was broken only by the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the secrets of the past, the threats of the present, and the uncertainties of the future. The warmth of their joined hands was a small comfort against the chilling premonition that settled over them, a premonition whispered in the dead of night, under the watchful gaze of the full moon. Chapter 10. The Price of Trust on the Frontier. The next morning, Jed announced his intention to leave. He claimed he'd found his way again and thanked Ethan for his hospitality. Emmy, however, remained unconvinced. His sudden departure felt too convenient, too contrived. The relief she should have felt was overshadowed by a lingering suspicion. "Don't let your guard down," she warned Ethan as they watched Jed ride away. "Something's not right." Ethan nodded, his eyes narrowed as he watched the receding figure. "I know. I can feel it." He was too interested in things he shouldn't have been. They spent the day reinforcing the cabin, checking their supplies, and making plans. They didn't know what Jed's true intentions were, but they were determined to be prepared for whatever he might be planning. The following days were filled with a tense anticipation. They worked together, their movements synchronized, their communication almost telepathic. They were two people, united against an unknown threat, their love for each other a source of strength and resilience. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Emmy said, "Do you think he'll come back?" Ethan sighed, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I don't know. But I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of him. He reached for the small, wooden box on the shelf, the one containing Sarah's letters. He opened it and took out the letters, his fingers tracing the faded handwriting. I should have told you about this sooner, he said, his voice low. About Sarah, about how she died. Emmy placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. You told me when you were ready, she said. That's all that matters. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude.
There's more to the story, Emmy, he said.
Something I haven't told anyone. He hesitated, then continued, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's brother, he blamed me for her death. He swore he'd get revenge. Emmy's heart skipped a beat. Do you think Jed is? Ethan nodded, his expression grim. It's possible. He never said his last name. And there was something familiar about him. Something I couldn't quite place. He closed the box and placed it back on the shelf. I should have been more careful, he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. I should have protected her. I should have protected you. You can't blame yourself, Ethan, Emmy said, her voice firm. You didn't know.
But I should have, he said.
I should have seen it coming. Emmy reached out and took his face in her hands, her thumbs gently wiping away the tears that were welling up in his eyes. We'll face it together, Ethan, she said. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. He leaned into her touch, his forehead resting against hers. I love you, Emmy, he whispered. I don't know what I'd do without you. And I love you, she said, her voice equally emotional. They held each other close, their love a shield against the fear and uncertainty that surrounded them. They knew that the price of trust on the frontier was high, that danger lurked around every corner. But they were ready to face it, together, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness. As the days turned into nights, and the nights into days, their vigilance remained. The quiet solitude of the cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a fortress. They were waiting, watching, their senses heightened, their hearts pounding in unison, bracing themselves for the inevitable return of the past, for the confrontation that they knew was coming. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. When would Jed return, and what price would they have to pay for the fragile peace they had found? The silence was no longer peaceful, but a taut string, vibrating with the anticipation of a storm yet to break. Chapter 11. Blood on the Snow, a Promise Broken. The attack came swiftly and brutally, under the cover of a moonless night. Emmy and Ethan were awakened by the sound of shattering glass, followed by the thud of bodies entering the cabin. They reacted instantly, years of frontier living having honed their instincts to a razor's edge. Ethan grabbed his rifle, while Emmy armed herself with a heavy iron skillet, the only weapon within reach. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire.
Jed,
Ethan shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. Show yourself. A gruff voice responded from the shadows. It ain't Jed you need to worry about, Slade. It's me, Ben Carter. Sarah's brother. Emmy gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan's suspicions had been confirmed. This ain't your fight, Carter. Ethan yelled. Let Emmy go. She's part of this now, Carter retorted. She's with you. That makes her my enemy. The sound of gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes illuminating the cabin in brief, terrifying bursts. Ethan returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. Emmy ducked behind the overturned table, the skillet held tightly in her hands. She could hear the sounds of a struggle, the grunts of men grappling, the thud of fists against flesh. She knew that Ethan was outnumbered, that he was fighting for his life, for their lives. She crept along the wall, trying to get a better view of the fight. She saw Ethan struggling with two men, while a third, presumably Carter, stood back, watching, his rifle trained on Ethan. Emmy knew she had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch Ethan be killed. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and charged towards Carter, the skillet raised above her head. She swung with all her might, the heavy iron connecting with Carter's head with a sickening thud. He staggered, dropping his rifle and collapsing to the floor. Ethan, taking advantage of the distraction, managed to overpower the two men who were attacking him. He knocked one unconscious with the butt of his rifle and shot the other at point-blank range. The cabin fell silent, the only sound Emmy's ragged breathing and the groans of the injured men. She rushed to Ethan's side, her hands trembling. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He nodded, his face bruised and bleeding.
"I'm fine.
"Thanks to you." He looked at Carter, who was lying motionless on the floor. "Is he?" Emmy knelt beside Carter, checking for a pulse.
"He's alive," she said.
"But unconscious." They tied up Carter and the other surviving attacker, their movements swift and efficient. They had survived the attack, but the cost had been high. The cabin was a wreck, their sanctuary violated, their peace shattered. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the scene, Emmy noticed something on the floor near Carter's body. It was a small, silver locket, identical to the one Ethan wore around his neck. She picked it up, her heart sinking. She recognized it instantly. It was Sarah's locket, the one Ethan had given her years ago. She looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with questions. He met her gaze, his expression grim. "He took it from me," he said, his voice low. After she died. He said he'd keep it as a reminder of his revenge." Emmy handed him the locket, her hand trembling. He took it, his fingers closing around it tightly. It was a symbol of his loss, of his pain, of the promise he had broken, the promise to protect Sarah. As they stood there, amidst the wreckage of their cabin, surrounded by the evidence of violence, Emmy knew that their lives had changed forever. The attack had brought the past crashing down upon them, forcing them to confront the demons they had tried so hard to bury. The blood on the snow was a stark reminder of the price of vengeance, of the fragility of life, and of the enduring power of love and loss. The faint smell of gunpowder mingled with the scent of pine, a bitter perfume that would forever be etched in their memories. Chapter 12. The Ghosts of Redemption Gulch. With Carter and his accomplice secured, Ethan and Emmy faced a difficult decision. They couldn't stay at the cabin, not anymore. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. They needed to find a safer place, a place where they could heal, both physically and emotionally. "There's a town," Ethan said, his voice weary, "about a day's ride from here. Redemption Gulch. It's small, but it's a place we can go." Emmy nodded, her mind racing. Redemption Gulch. The name itself was ironic, a cruel twist of fate. Could they truly find redemption in a place named for second chances? They packed what little they could salvage from the wreckage of the cabin, loaded Bess, and set off, leaving behind the shattered remnants of their sanctuary. The journey was arduous, both physically and emotionally. They were both injured, exhausted, and haunted by the events of the previous night. They traveled mostly in silence, their thoughts consumed by the past, by the present, by the uncertain future. Emmy couldn't shake the image of Sarah's locket, of the pain in Ethan's eyes when he'd spoken of her death. She knew that he still blamed himself, that he carried a burden of guilt that might never be lifted. As they rode, Ethan began to tell her more about Sarah, about their life together, about the dreams they had shared. He spoke of her laughter, her kindness, her unwavering spirit. He painted a picture of a woman who had been full of life, full of love, a woman who had deserved to live. Emmy listened, her heart aching for Ethan, for Sarah, for the life that had been stolen from them. She understood now the depth of his pain, the reason for his solitude, his reluctance to open his heart again. They reached Redemption Gulch as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. The town was small, a collection of weathered buildings huddled together in the vastness of the wilderness. It looked like a place forgotten by time, a place where people came to escape their past, to find a new beginning. They found a small, empty cabin on the outskirts of town, a place that offered some semblance of privacy, some protection from prying eyes. They unloaded Bess, tended to their injuries, and settled in, their movements weary, their spirits low. The townspeople, a mix of miners, ranchers, and merchants, were wary of strangers, but they offered Ethan and Emmy a cautious welcome. They provided them with food, supplies, and information, their curiosity tempered by a respect for privacy, a common understanding of the unspoken code of the West. Ethan arranged for the sheriff to take custody of Carter and his accomplice, ensuring that they would be brought to justice. The sheriff, a grizzled old man named Jedediah, listened to Ethan's story with a grim nod, his eyes reflecting the harsh realities of frontier life. "Reckon you've had a rough go of it," Jedediah said, his voice gravelly. "But you're safe here.
For now."
Emmy and Ethan spent their first few days in Redemption Gulch recovering from their injuries, adjusting to their new surroundings, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. They kept to themselves, avoiding contact with the townspeople, their wounds still too raw, their trust too fragile. But the ghosts of the past, the memories of Sarah, of the attack, of the blood on the snow, continued to haunt them. They were both struggling in their own ways to cope with the trauma, to find a way to move forward. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Emmy said, "Do you think we can ever be happy, Ethan? Truly happy?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "I don't know, Emmy," he said. "I honestly don't know." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "But I want to try," he said, his voice firm. "I want to try with you." Emmy squeezed his hand, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe that they could find happiness, that they could build a new life together. But the ghosts of Redemption Gulch, like the ghosts of their past, lingered, casting a long shadow over their fragile dreams. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken question of whether redemption was truly possible, or if the past would forever define their future. The crackling fire offered little warmth against the chill that settled over them, a chill that came not from the outside world, but from the depths of their own haunted hearts. Chapter 13. A desperate ride for sanctuary. Despite the sheriff's assurances, a sense of unease permeated their days in Redemption Gulch. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Carter's associates might still be lurking, seeking revenge. He noticed unfamiliar faces in the saloon, whispers exchanged in hushed tones, and a general atmosphere of suspicion that made him wary. "I don't like it here, Emmy," he confessed one evening, his voice low and troubled. "I don't feel safe." Emmy shared his concerns. She, too, had noticed the subtle signs of hostility, the furtive glances, the feeling of being an outsider, an unwelcome presence. "What do you want to do?" she asked, her voice mirroring his anxiety. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "I know a place," he said, his voice hesitant.
"A ranch."
"It's far, remote, but it's safe. It belonged to a friend of mine a long time ago. He's gone now, but I think we could go there. Start over." The idea of another move, another uprooting, was daunting, but Emmy saw the desperation in Ethan's eyes, the need for a true sanctuary, a place where they could finally escape the shadows of the past. "Let's do it," she said, her voice firm, her decision made. They planned their departure carefully, secretly gathering supplies, preparing best for the long journey. They knew they couldn't trust anyone in Redemption Gulch, not even the sheriff. The town, despite its name, felt more like a trap than a refuge. They left under the cover of darkness, slipping away unnoticed, their departure as silent as their arrival. They rode hard, pushing themselves and best to their limits, driven by a desperate need to escape, to find a place where they could finally be safe. The journey was fraught with peril. They had to avoid the main roads, sticking to less traveled trails, constantly on the lookout for pursuers. They slept in shifts, taking turns keeping watch, their senses heightened, their nerves on edge. One evening, as they were camped by a small stream, they heard the sound of approaching riders. Ethan grabbed his rifle, his body tense, ready to defend themselves. Emmy held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The riders emerged from the trees, their faces obscured by the darkness. Ethan raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger, ready to fire. "Hold your fire, Slade." A voice called out. "It's me, Jedediah." Ethan lowered his rifle, his body relaxing slightly, but his suspicion remained. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Jedediah rode closer, his face illuminated by the moonlight. He looked grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and regret. I came to warn you, he said, his voice low. Carter's men, they're still out there. And they know you left town. They're looking for you. Emmy's heart sank. She had hoped they had escaped, but it seemed their pursuers were relentless. How did they know? Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Jedediah hesitated, then said, There's a leak in town. Someone's been informing them. I don't know who. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a genuine sense of apology. I'm sorry, he said. I thought you'd be safe here. I was wrong. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. We appreciate the warning, Sheriff, he said. But we can't stay here. We have to keep moving. Jedediah nodded in understanding. There's a pass, he said, through the mountains. It's treacherous, but it'll take you to the other side, to the open plains. It's your best chance of escaping them. He gave them directions, his voice urgent. Go now, he said, and Godspeed. They thanked him, mounted their horses, and rode off, following Jedediah's instructions. The pass was indeed treacherous, a narrow, winding path through steep, rocky terrain. But they pressed on, driven by the hope of reaching safety, of finding the sanctuary that Ethan had promised. As they rode, Emmy couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude towards Jedediah. Despite the betrayal within his town, he had risked his own safety to warn them, to help them escape. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were still glimmers of hope, of kindness, of humanity. The desperate ride was a testament to their resilience, their determination to survive, and their unwavering belief in the possibility of a better future, a future free from the shadows of the past. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of pine and the faint whisper of freedom, a freedom that lay just beyond the treacherous mountains, a freedom they were determined to reach, no matter the cost. Chapter 14. Scars that Time Cannot Erase. The journey through the mountain pass was grueling, testing their endurance and their spirits. The narrow trail was treacherous, with sheer drops on either side, and the weather was unpredictable, shifting from sunshine to snow squalls in a matter of hours. But they pressed on, driven by the need to escape, to reach the sanctuary of Ethan's friend's ranch. They finally emerged from the pass, the vast expanse of the open plains stretching before them, a breathtaking vista of rolling hills and endless sky. They had made it. They had escaped their pursuers for now. They rode for several more days, following Ethan's directions, until they finally reached their destination. The ranch was nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by tall trees and a clear, running stream. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, a haven from the dangers they had faced. The ranch house itself was deserted, weathered, and showing signs of neglect, but it was still structurally sound. It was a two-story building, made of logs and stone, with a wide porch that overlooked the valley. It felt like a place that had once been filled with life, with laughter, with love. They spent the first few days cleaning the ranch house, making it habitable. They swept the floors, cleared away the cobwebs, and repaired the broken windows. It was hard work, but it was also therapeutic, a way to reclaim the space, to make it their own. As they worked, Emmy noticed the scars on Ethan's body, scars that went beyond the recent injuries he had sustained in the attack. There were old scars, faded but still visible, reminders of a life lived on the edge, a life filled with hardship and danger. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Emmy gently touched one of the scars on his arm. "How did you get this?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan hesitated, then said, "It was a long time ago. A fight. Over a card game." He didn't elaborate, and Emmy didn't press him. She knew that some scars were too deep to be spoken of, that some memories were too painful to be revisited. She, too, had scars both visible and invisible. The emotional scars of losing Samuel, of running for her life, of fearing for her safety, were still raw, still tender. She knew that time might heal some wounds, but others would remain, a permanent part of who she was. As the days turned into weeks, they settled into a routine, working the ranch, tending to the animals that Ethan had managed to acquire from a nearby settlement, and slowly rebuilding their lives. They were isolated, far from any towns or settlements, but they felt safe, protected by the vastness of the wilderness. They began to talk more openly about their pasts, sharing their stories, their fears, their hopes for the future. Ethan told her more about his life before Sarah, about his childhood on a ranch, about his dreams of becoming a rancher himself. Emmy, in turn, shared her dreams of traveling, of seeing the world, of finding a place where she could belong. They realized that their dreams, while different, were not incompatible. They could build a life together, a life that combined their individual aspirations, their shared love for each other. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Ethan said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding happiness." Emmy looked at him, her eyes questioning. I think we can be happy here, Emmy," he said, his voice firm. "I think we can build a life together. A good life." Tears welled up in Emmy's eyes. It was the moment she'd been waiting for, the confirmation that he was ready to move on, to embrace the future, to leave the past behind. "I think so too, Ethan," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I love you, Emmy," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I love you more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she said, her voice equally emotional. They held each other close, their love a beacon of hope in the vastness of the wilderness. The scars that time could not erase were still there, reminders of the pain they had endured, but they were no longer the defining features of their lives. They were simply marks of survival. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking backdrop to their quiet moment of connection, a moment that solidified their commitment to a future built on love, trust, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. They were finally home. Chapter 15. The sheriff's shadow looms large. Life at the ranch settled into a peaceful rhythm. Emmy and Ethan worked hard, tending to the land and the animals, their days filled with the simple routines of rural life. They were isolated, but they weren't lonely. They had each other, and that was enough. However, the long arm of the law, even on the frontier, had a way of reaching into the most secluded corners. Several weeks after they had settled into the ranch, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Ethan, ever vigilant, recognized the silhouette instantly. "It's Jedediah," he said, his voice tight with apprehension. Emmy felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. Why had the sheriff of Redemption Gulch followed them? Jedediah rode up to the ranch house, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and weariness. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff and sore, evidence of a long and arduous journey. "Slade, Emmy," he greeted them, his voice gravelly. "We need to talk." Ethan nodded, his expression guarded. "Come inside, Sheriff." They sat down at the rough-hewn table in the ranch house, the silence heavy with unspoken questions. Jedediah accepted a cup of coffee from Emmy, his hands trembling slightly. "I've come with news," he said, his voice low. "About Carter." Emmy and Ethan exchanged a worried glance. "He escaped," Jedediah said, his voice filled with frustration and self-reproach. "Him and his man. They had help. From the inside." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who?" Jedediah hesitated, then said, "It was my deputy. He was being paid by Carter's family. They're powerful, influential. They have connections everywhere." Emmy felt a surge of anger, of betrayal. They had trusted Jedediah, had relied on him to keep them safe. And now he was telling them that Carter was free, that he was once again a threat. "What does this mean, Sheriff?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Jedediah sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It means you're not safe," he said. "Not anywhere. Carter's not going to give up. He's obsessed with revenge." He looked at them, his eyes filled with a genuine sense of apology. "I came to warn you," he said, "and to ask for your help." Emmy and Ethan were surprised. "Our help?" Emmy asked, her voice incredulous. "What can we do?" Jedediah leaned forward, his voice urgent. "I need your help to bring Carter to justice," he said. "He's a danger to everyone. And I can't trust anyone in my own town." He looked at Ethan, his eyes pleading. "You know the land. You know Carter. You're the only ones who can help me stop him. Ethan hesitated. He was reluctant to get involved, to put himself and Emmy in danger again. They had come to this ranch seeking peace, seeking sanctuary. But he also knew that Jedediah was right. Carter was a threat, not just to them, but to everyone. He looked at Emmy, his eyes questioning. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "We'll help you." Ethan nodded, his decision made. "We'll help you, Sheriff," he said. "But we do it our way." Jedediah agreed. He knew that Ethan and Emmy were resourceful, that they were capable of taking care of themselves. He trusted them, more than he trusted anyone in his own town. They spent the next few hours planning, strategizing, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Carter. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that it would be dangerous. But they were ready. They were united, their love for each other a source of strength and courage. The sheriff's shadow, once a symbol of threat, now represented a fragile alliance, a desperate attempt to bring justice to a lawless land. The peaceful rhythm of the ranch was shattered, replaced by the tense anticipation of a showdown, a battle between good and evil, between revenge and redemption. The quiet evening air was charged with the unspoken promise of violence, a promise that would soon be fulfilled. Chapter 16. Confessions Under a Starless Sky. The plan was simple, yet fraught with danger. Jedediah would return to Redemption Gulch, pretending to have found no trace of Ethan and Emmy. He would spread the word that they had likely fled far away, disappearing into the vast wilderness. Meanwhile, Ethan and Emmy would track Carter, using their knowledge of the land and their understanding of his vengeful nature. The first few days of tracking were uneventful. They followed Carter's trail, a trail that was deliberately obscured, evidence of his cunning and his determination to avoid capture. They moved slowly, cautiously, aware that they were walking into a trap, that Carter was likely expecting them. One evening, as they were camped in a secluded canyon, Ethan said, "He's leading us somewhere, Emmy. He has a plan." Emmy nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the campfire. "I know. He wants a confrontation. On his terms. We need to be careful," Ethan said, his voice low. "We need to be smarter than him." They continued their pursuit, their senses heightened, their nerves on edge. They were like two wolves, tracking their prey, their movements synchronized, their communication almost telepathic. They finally found Carter's camp in a remote, desolate area, a place known as Devil's Basin. It was a natural fortress, surrounded by steep cliffs and narrow canyons, a perfect place for an ambush. They observed the camp from a distance, watching Carter and his men, their faces illuminated by the firelight. There were more of them than they had anticipated, at least 6, all heavily armed. "We can't take them head-on," Emmy said, her voice a whisper. "We'll be outnumbered." Ethan nodded, his mind racing, trying to devise a plan. "We need to divide them," he said. "Weaken them. Make them come to us." They spent the next few hours preparing, setting traps, creating diversions, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They were like two ghosts, moving silently through the darkness, preparing for a battle that would determine their fate. As the night wore on, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the basin in a dense, white shroud. Visibility was reduced to almost zero, the silence broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote. Emmy turned to Ethan, the firelight casting dancing shadows on his face. "This fog, it changes things." Ethan nodded, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "It does. It gives us an advantage." He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I have a plan," he said. "But it's risky." He explained his plan, a daring, audacious plan that relied on stealth, deception, and a bit of luck. Emmy listened, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a dangerous plan, but it was their only chance. "I trust you, Ethan," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." They put their plan into action, moving silently through the fog, their movements like shadows, their presence almost undetectable. They used the fog to their advantage, creating confusion, sowing discord, drawing Carter's men away from their camp one by one. Ethan, Using his skills as a hunter and tracker, lured several of Carter's men into a narrow canyon where he ambushed them, disarming them and tying them up. Emmy, using her knowledge of herbs and plants, created a smoke screen, a mixture of dried leaves and roots that produced a thick, disorienting fog, further adding to the chaos. As the night wore on, the number of Carter's men dwindled, their confidence replaced by fear, their unity shattered by the unseen enemy that stalked them in the fog. Finally, only Carter remained. He was alone, isolated, his bravado replaced by a desperate, animalistic fear. Ethan and Emmy confronted him, their figures emerging from the fog like avenging angels. Carter raised his rifle, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with terror. "You can't win, Carter," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "It's over." Carter hesitated, then, slowly, lowered his rifle. He knew he was defeated. He had lost. "Why, Slade?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why did you have to kill her?" Ethan's face was a mask of pain. "I didn't kill her, Carter," he said. "It was an accident. I swear to you. It was an accident." He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I loved her, Carter," he said. "I loved her more than anything. I would have given my life for hers." Carter stared at him, his eyes searching, questioning. He seemed to be struggling with something, wrestling with the truth. The confession, torn from Ethan's soul under the starless, fog-laden sky, hung heavy in the air. A tear slipped down Carter's cheek. I don't know what to believe anymore," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Emmy stepped forward, her hand reaching out to Carter. "Believe the truth," she said. "Believe in forgiveness. Believe in a new beginning." Carter looked at her, then at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, regret, and a glimmer of hope. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the first rays of dawn, illuminating the scene of confession, of confrontation, of a potential turning point. The silence was no longer threatening, but filled with the possibility of healing, of understanding, of a future free from the endless cycle of vengeance. Chapter 17. The Outlaw's Code, The Woman's Choice. Carter's surrender marked not an end, but a fragile beginning. The weight of the past, the years of hatred and vengeance, couldn't be erased with a single confession. The legal process, even on the frontier, had to run its course. Jedediah arrived, guided by the sounds of the earlier skirmishes, and took Carter and his remaining men into custody. The scene was somber, the air thick with the aftermath of violence and the lingering questions of justice. "You did good, Slade," Emmy, Jedediah said, his voice weary but filled with respect. "You brought him in alive. That's more than most would have done." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. He knew that bringing Carter in alive was the right thing to do, but it didn't erase the pain, the loss, the years of running. Carter was taken back to Redemption Gulch, where he would face trial. The town was abuzz with the news, the whispers and rumors spreading like wildfire. Some were relieved, some were skeptical, and some were still loyal to Carter's family, their resentment simmering beneath the surface. Ethan and Emmy returned to the ranch, their sanctuary once again, but the peace they had found there was shattered. They were both exhausted, emotionally drained, their bodies aching from the ordeal. They spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection, trying to process the events, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. They knew that the trial would be difficult, that they would have to face Carter again, that they would have to relive the trauma of the past. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Emmy said, "What'll happen to him, Ethan?" Ethan sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," he said. "It depends on the judge, on the jury, on the evidence." "Do you think he'll be convicted?" she asked. "He should be," Ethan said. "He committed crimes. He attacked us. He threatened our lives." But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a recognition that justice on the frontier was often a fickle thing, influenced by power, money, and connections. "What if he's not?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know. The uncertainty hung heavy in the air, a cloud of doubt that threatened to overshadow their fragile peace. A few weeks later, They received a summons to appear at Carter's trial in Redemption Gulch. They knew they had to go, that they had to face their past, that they had to testify to the truth. They returned to Redemption Gulch, their arrival greeted with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and hostility. The town was divided, the lines drawn between those who supported Carter and those who believed in justice. The trial was held in the town's makeshift courthouse, a small, crowded room filled with the scent of sweat and fear. Carter sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. Ethan and Emmy testified, their voices clear and firm, recounting the events of the past few months, the attack on the cabin, the chase, the final confrontation. They spoke of Sarah, of her death, of Carter's vengeful pursuit. Carter's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man from a larger town, tried to discredit them, to paint them as liars, as outlaws, as people who couldn't be trusted. He questioned their motives, their pasts, their relationship. But Ethan and Emmy stood their ground, their truth unwavering, their love for each other a shield against the lawyer's attacks. Finally, it was Carter's turn to testify. He took the stand, his voice hesitant, his eyes avoiding Ethan's gaze. He told his story, a story of grief, of anger, of a desperate need for revenge. He admitted to attacking Ethan and Emmy, to wanting to kill them. But he also spoke of his doubts, of his growing realization that Ethan might not have been responsible for Sarah's death. He looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and regret. I don't know what to believe anymore, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I just wanted justice for my sister. The jury deliberated for hours, their decision hanging in the balance. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, the jury returned, their faces grim, their verdict a heavy weight on their shoulders. We find the defendant not guilty, the foreman announced, his voice trembling slightly. A gasp went through the courtroom, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and outrage. Emmy felt her heart sink. She had hoped for justice, for closure, but it seemed that the outlaw's code, the code of vengeance and family loyalty, had prevailed. Ethan, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. He had expected this outcome, had known that justice on the frontier was often a matter of luck, not law. It was Emmy's choice now, and his. As they left the courthouse, Emmy turned to Ethan. What do we do now? Ethan looked at her, and for an instant, she saw a familiar sadness etched on his face. It faded in an instant, and he put his arm around her, and he said, we go home. The woman's choice and the outlaw's code were no longer a deciding factor. They had each other. Chapter 18. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The return to the ranch was somber. While the not guilty verdict had lifted a legal threat, it had also ripped open old wounds and cast a long shadow of doubt over their future. The justice system had failed them, and the weight of that injustice pressed heavily on Emmy's heart. Ethan, though outwardly stoic, was clearly wrestling with the outcome. He became withdrawn, spending long hours working on the ranch, his silence a reflection of his inner turmoil. Emmy tried to reach him, to offer comfort, but he seemed to have retreated into himself, his emotions locked away behind a wall of stoicism. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Emmy said, we can't let this consume us, Ethan.
We have to move on.
Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own.
How?
He asked, his voice raw. How can we move on when justice hasn't been served? Justice isn't always found in a courtroom, Ethan, she said. Sometimes, it's found in forgiveness. In letting go. He shook his head, his expression grim. I can't forgive him, Emmy.
Not yet.
Maybe not ever. Emmy understood his anger, his frustration, his sense of betrayal. But she also knew that holding on to those feelings would only destroy them, would poison their future. A few days later, a visitor arrived at the ranch, an unexpected and unwelcome visitor. It was Deputy Miller, the man who had betrayed Jedediah and helped Carter escape. He rode up to the ranch house, his face smug, his eyes filled with a mixture of arrogance and defiance. Ethan confronted him, his rifle held loosely in his hand, his body tense, ready for a confrontation. "What do you want, Miller?" he asked, his voice cold. Miller smiled, a cynical, knowing smile. "I came to deliver a message," he said. "From Carter." Emmy's heart skipped a beat. She felt a surge of fear, of apprehension. "Carter wants to meet with you, Slade," Miller said. "He wants to talk." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I have nothing to say to him." "He says he has something to tell you," Miller said. "Something important. About Sarah." Ethan hesitated. The mention of Sarah's name, the hint of new information, was a lure he couldn't ignore. "Where?" he asked, his voice grudging. Miller gave him directions, a remote location, a place known as Whispering Pines. He told him to come alone, unarmed. "I'll be there," Ethan said, his voice firm. Emmy tried to dissuade him, to convince him that it was a trap, that he shouldn't go. But Ethan was adamant. He had to know what Carter wanted, had to hear what he had to say about Sarah. "I'll be careful, Emmy," he said, his voice reassuring. "I promise. I'll be back." He kissed her, a long, lingering kiss, a kiss that was filled with love, with fear, with a sense of foreboding. Then he rode off, leaving Emmy alone at the ranch, her heart filled with dread. She watched him go, her eyes following his figure until he disappeared from view. She had a bad feeling, a premonition that something terrible was going to happen. She waited, hours turning into an eternity, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the ranch, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. But Emmy didn't notice the beauty of the sunset. She was too consumed by fear, by worry, by the gnawing feeling that she had made a terrible mistake in letting Ethan go alone. As darkness fell, she heard the sound of approaching riders. Her heart leaped with hope, believing that Ethan had returned. But as the riders drew closer, she realized that it wasn't Ethan. It was Miller, and he was accompanied by several of Carter's men. They surrounded the ranch house, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. Miller dismounted and approached Emmy, his eyes filled with a cold, cruel satisfaction. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice mocking. Emmy knew then that she had been betrayed, that Ethan had walked into a trap, that she was now at the mercy of his enemies. The bitter sting of betrayal washed over her, a cold wave of despair that threatened to drown her. She had trusted Ethan's judgment, had believed in his ability to protect himself, but she had been wrong. And now, she feared, she would pay the price for her naivety. The silence of the ranch was shattered by the menacing presence of the outlaws, their shadows looming large in the fading light, a stark reminder of the danger she was in, of the betrayal that had sealed her fate, and possibly Ethan's. Chapter 19. A Reckoning at Dawn. Miller and Carter's men took Emmy captive, tying her hands and forcing her to mount a horse. They rode through the night, the darkness amplifying her fear and uncertainty. She had no idea where they were taking her, or what their plans were, but she knew it couldn't be good. She tried to remain calm, to think clearly, to find a way to escape, but her mind was racing, her heart pounding with terror. She thought of Ethan, of his promise to return, of the kiss they had shared before he rode off. She clung to the hope that he was still alive, that he would find her, that they would somehow find a way to overcome this. They finally arrived at their destination, a dilapidated shack hidden deep in the woods. It was a desolate, isolated place, a place where no one would hear her screams, where no one would come to her rescue. They forced her inside, pushing her onto a dirt floor, the cold seeping into her bones. Miller stood over her, his face a mask of cruelty. "Where's Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Miller smiled, a chilling, sinister smile.
"He's indisposed," he said.
"Let's just say he won't be bothering us anymore." Emmy's heart sank. She refused to believe that Ethan was dead, but Miller's words, his demeanor, filled her with a dread she couldn't ignore. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We want what's rightfully ours," Miller said. "Carter's inheritance. The ranch. Everything." Emmy realized then that the entire charade, the trial, Carter's supposed remorse had all been a ruse, a carefully orchestrated plan to get their hands on the ranch, on the land that Ethan had inherited from his friend. "It's not yours," she said, her voice defiant. "It belongs to Ethan." Miller laughed, a harsh, mocking laugh. "Ethan's in no position to claim it," he said. "And neither are you." He signaled to one of his men, who stepped forward, holding a piece of paper. It was a deed, a forged deed, transferring ownership of the ranch to Carter. "Sign it," Miller ordered, his voice threatening. Emmy refused. She wouldn't betray Ethan, wouldn't give them what they wanted. She would fight them, even if it meant her life. Miller grabbed her hand, forcing her fingers around a pen. She struggled, resisting with all her might, but he was too strong. He forced her hand to the paper, forcing her to sign the deed, her signature a shaky, illegible scrawl. "There," Miller said, his voice triumphant. "It's done. The ranch is ours." He released her hand, and Emmy collapsed to the floor, her body trembling, her spirit crushed. She had lost everything. Ethan, the ranch, her freedom. But as she lay there, in the darkness, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let them win. She would find a way to fight back, to reclaim what was rightfully hers, to avenge Ethan. She refused to complete the thought. Suddenly, the door of the shack burst open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Ethan, his face bruised and bloodied, but his eyes blazing with fury. "Let her go, Miller," he shouted, his voice echoing in the small space. Emmy's heart leaped with hope. He was alive. He had come for her. Miller and his men were stunned, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They had thought Ethan was dead, had left him for dead at Whispering Pines. Ethan had been ambushed, as Emmy had feared, but he hadn't been killed. He had been shot, wounded, but he had managed to escape, to track them, to find Emmy. A fierce gunfight erupted, the shack filled with the sounds of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder, the cries of men. Ethan fought with a ferocity born of love and desperation, his movements swift and deadly. Emmy, despite her bound hands, managed to kick one of the men, knocking him off balance. She scrambled to her feet, trying to stay out of the line of fire. Ethan shot Miller, the bullet finding its mark, sending him sprawling to the floor. He then turned his attention to the remaining men, taking them down one by one, his aim precise and unwavering. Finally, the shack fell silent, the only sound Emmy's ragged breathing and the groans of the injured men. Ethan rushed to her side, cutting her bonds with his knife. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I thought you were dead," she whispered. He pulled her close, holding her tight, his body trembling with relief. "I promised I'd come back," he said, his voice hoarse. "I always keep my promises." As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the scene of carnage, Ethan and Emmy emerged from the shack, their bodies battered and bruised, but their spirits unbroken. They had faced death, had stared into the abyss, and had emerged victorious. They had fought for their love, for their future, for their right to live in peace. They stood there, hand in hand, watching the sunrise, a new day dawning, a new beginning, a promise of a future free from the shadows of the past. The reckoning at dawn had been brutal, but it had also been cathartic, a cleansing fire that had purged the evil that had threatened to consume them. The silence was no longer menacing, but filled with the quiet strength of two souls, bound together by love, forged in the crucible of violence, and ready to face whatever the future might hold. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. With Miller and his men defeated, Ethan and Emmy knew they couldn't simply return to the ranch. Carter, though still in custody, remained a threat, his influence and connections a constant danger. They needed to ensure their safety, to find a way to permanently end the cycle of violence and vengeance. They decided to return to Redemption Gulch, to confront the situation head-on, to expose the corruption that had allowed Carter to operate with impunity. They knew it was a risky move, that they would be facing opposition, but they were determined to see justice done, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been wronged by Carter and his family. They arrived in Redemption Gulch under the watchful eye of Jedediah, who, despite his previous failure, was relieved to see them alive and determined to help them. He had gathered evidence of his deputy's betrayal, of Carter's connections to powerful figures in the territory, and of the widespread corruption that had plagued the town for years. "We'll need to be careful," Jedediah warned them. "Carter's family won't give up easily. They'll have people on the inside, watching, waiting." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "We're ready for them." They spent the next few days gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, building a case against Carter and his network of corruption. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with danger, but they were determined to see it through. Emmy, using her knowledge of law and her persuasive skills, managed to convince several key figures in the town to come forward, to testify against Carter, to expose the truth. She spoke with a passion and conviction that moved even the most skeptical, her voice echoing the sentiments of a community that had long been silenced by fear. Finally, the day arrived for a final showdown. A special hearing was convened, not in the makeshift courthouse, but in the town square, open to the public, a symbol of transparency and accountability. The entire town turned out, the atmosphere tense, the air thick with anticipation. Carter was brought before the crowd, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and fear. He was surrounded by his lawyers, a team of well-dressed, well-connected men who were determined to protect their client, to maintain the status quo. Ethan and Emmy stood before the crowd, their faces resolute, their voices clear and firm. They presented their evidence, their testimony a damning indictment of Carter's crimes, of his family's influence, of the corruption that had poisoned the town. They spoke of Sarah, of her death, of Carter's vengeful pursuit, of the attacks they had endured, of the lives that had been destroyed. They spoke of the need for justice, for accountability, for a new beginning, a future free from fear and corruption. Carter's lawyers tried to discredit them, to paint them as outlaws, as liars, as people who couldn't be trusted. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses compelling, the truth undeniable. Finally, the judge, a stern, unyielding man who had been brought in from a neighboring territory to ensure impartiality, delivered his verdict. "I find the defendant, Ben Carter, guilty of all charges," he announced, his voice echoing across the town square. "And I sentence him to a lengthy term in prison." A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a wave of cheers and applause. Justice had been served finally. The reign of terror, of corruption, of vengeance, was over. But the final confrontation was not just legal, it was emotional. As Carter was being led away, he looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and something else. Regret? Resignation? Understanding? Ethan met his gaze, his own eyes unwavering. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound sense of sadness, of loss, of the futility of violence. Emmy stepped forward, her hand reaching out to Ethan. He took it, his fingers intertwining with hers, their love a shield against the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world that had been consumed by hatred and revenge. As the sun set, casting long shadows over Redemption Gulch, Ethan and Emmy stood together, their faces turned towards the horizon, towards the future. They had faced their demons, had confronted their past, had emerged victorious, not through violence, but through courage, through resilience, through love. They had found their redemption, not in a place, but in each other. The final confrontation had been of hearts and of horizons, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a promise of a new beginning, a future filled with hope, with peace, with the quiet strength of two souls, bound together forever. Epilogue. Years passed, and the ranch became a haven, not just for Emmy and Ethan, but for others seeking refuge from the harsh realities of the frontier. They built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with the simple joys of hard work and shared dreams. The scars of the past remained, reminders of the pain they had endured, but they were no longer defining features of their lives. They were simply marks of survival, testaments to their resilience, their courage, their unwavering love for each other. Emmy and Ethan had children, a boy and a girl, who grew up strong and free, surrounded by the beauty of the wilderness, nurtured by the love of their parents. They learned the values of honesty, integrity, and compassion, values that had been forged in the crucible of violence and betrayal. Redemption Gulch, too, underwent a transformation. The corruption that had plagued the town for so long was rooted out, replaced by a new generation of leaders who were committed to justice, to fairness, to building a community based on trust and respect. Jedediah, the old sheriff, remained a friend and ally, a reminder of the importance of integrity, of the courage to stand up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. Carter, after serving his time, was released from prison. He returned to Redemption Gulch, a changed man, humbled by his experiences, seeking forgiveness, not just from Ethan and Emmy, but from the entire community. He approached Ethan and Emmy one day, his face etched with remorse, his eyes filled with a genuine sense of regret. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. Ethan looked at him, his expression unreadable. He had wrestled with his feelings towards Carter for years, had struggled to reconcile the anger and the pain with the need for forgiveness, for closure. He finally spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. I forgive you, Carter, he said. Not for you, but for us. For Sarah. Emmy nodded, her hand reaching out to Ethan, their fingers intertwining. She, too, had found a way to forgive, to let go of the past, to embrace the future. Carter left Redemption Gulch, a free man, but also a burdened man, carrying the weight of his past, seeking redemption not in a place, but in a life of service, of making amends for the harm he had caused. As the years turned into decades, Emmy and Ethan grew old together, their love enduring, their bond unbreakable. They watched their children grow up, marry, and have children of their own, the ranch becoming a gathering place for generations, a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of love. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Emmy said, "We found our redemption, Ethan." "Didn't we?" Ethan smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his face weathered and lined, but still filled with the same love, the same tenderness that she had seen in him all those years ago. "Yes, Emmy," he said, his voice soft. "We did." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, their touch as familiar, as comforting, as it had been on that first night, in the midst of a blizzard, when a storm had brought them together, when a drifter had found shelter, and when two lost souls had found a love that would last a lifetime. The vast, star-studded sky stretched above them, a silent witness to their enduring love, a love that had weathered the storms of the past, a love that had found its home on the frontier, a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places, a love that would live on forever. The end.